If a child suddenly stops telling you about their day, do not ignore it, because silence often arrives long before the truth does. My name is Sharon Mitchell, and for most of my life, the happiest title I ever carried was not mother, wife, or business owner. It was grandma. My granddaughter Lily was 15 and my grandson Noah was 12, and from the day they were born, we shared a bond that filled my life with purpose. Every Wednesday after school, they would call me. Every Sunday afternoon, they usually stopped by my house with their father Jason. We baked cookies, played board games, watched old movies, and talked about everything from science projects to favorite songs. I knew the names of their teachers, their friends, and even the pets they wished their parents would let them have. That was why the phone call felt so wrong. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Franklin, Tennessee. I had just finished watering flowers on my back porch when I realized I had not heard from Lily in nearly a week. That was unusual. Normally, she would send at least a text message about school or volleyball practice. I smiled as I dialed her number, expecting our usual conversation. She answered on the third ring. For a moment, I felt relieved. Then she spoke. "Hi, Grandma." Her voice sounded distant. Not angry, not upset, just distant. I asked how school was going. "Fine." I asked about volleyball. "Good." I asked whether she was excited about an upcoming school event she had been talking about for months. "I guess." The entire conversation lasted less than 20 seconds before she said she needed to go. Then the call ended. I stared at the phone in my hand. Something felt off. Lily had always been talkative. Sometimes our conversations lasted 30 minutes, sometimes longer. Yet this time it felt as though she could not wait to get off the phone. I told myself not to overreact. Teenagers change. They become busy. They become independent. That explanation seemed reasonable until the same thing happened with Noah. 2 days later, I called him after his baseball practice. Normally, he would eagerly tell me about every inning and every hit. This time he sounded distracted. He answered politely, but offered almost nothing. Every question received a short response. Every conversation ended quickly. When I asked whether he wanted to come over that weekend to make homemade pizza like we usually did, he hesitated before saying he would have to check with his mother. That answer surprised me. In the past, Noah would have immediately said yes. As the days passed, the pattern continued. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Calls became shorter. Invitations seemed harder to arrange. None of it was dramatic enough to trigger alarm, yet together the changes formed something impossible to ignore. One evening, while sitting alone in my living room, I found myself scrolling through old photographs on my phone. There was Lily holding a birthday cake we had baked together. There was Noah proudly displaying a fishing rod after catching his first fish at a local lake. Looking at those pictures, I felt a strange ache in my chest. Nothing had happened that I could point to. No argument. No disagreement. No obvious conflict. And yet somehow, the children who once shared everything with me suddenly felt miles away. What I did not know then was that the distance had not appeared by accident. Someone had been quietly building it, one conversation at a time. Over the next 2 weeks, the distance continued growing in ways that were difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. At first, I kept searching for reasonable explanations. School was demanding. Sports schedules were busy. Teenagers naturally become more independent. Every time I felt concerned, I reminded myself of those facts. Yet deep down, something told me this was different. The first real warning sign came on a Saturday morning. For years, Lily and Noah had participated in a local community event every spring. We always attended together. Sometimes I helped serve refreshments. Sometimes I simply sat in the audience and cheered them on. It had become one of our traditions. That year, the event came and went without a single mention. I only learned about it when a neighbor casually asked why I had not attended. I smiled politely and pretended I already knew what she was talking about. The truth was much harder to admit. Nobody had invited me. That evening, I called Jason to ask how the event had gone. He sounded surprised that I had not been there. Before he could say much more, I heard Rebecca's voice in the background, and the conversation quickly shifted to another topic. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but afterward I sat quietly at my kitchen table feeling unsettled. A few days later, I sent Lily a photograph I had found while organizing old family albums. It showed the two of us baking cookies when she was 8 years old. Normally, she would have responded immediately. Instead, nearly 24 hours passed before a brief reply appeared. Nice picture. Nothing more. No questions. No memories. No smiley face. Just 2 words. I stared at the screen for a long time. It was not the response itself that hurt. It was how unfamiliar it felt. Then came Noah's birthday. For nearly a decade, I had been one of the first people he called whenever something exciting happened. This year, I learned about his birthday dinner from a social media post shared by a distant relative. The photograph showed a smiling group gathered around a restaurant table. Jason was there. Rebecca was there. Lily was there. Noah was there. Several cousins were there. My chair was the only one missing. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the reservation had limited seating. Maybe plans had changed unexpectedly. Yet when I finally spoke with Noah 2 days later, he casually mentioned how much fun everyone had. He spoke as though my absence was completely normal. That realization hurt more than being excluded. It meant the idea of me being there no longer seemed automatic to him. One evening, while watering flowers in my front yard, I noticed Lily walking with friends across the neighborhood. Instinctively, I waved. For a brief moment, she seemed uncertain whether to wave back. Eventually, she lifted her hand and smiled politely before continuing down the sidewalk. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it left a knot in my stomach. This was not the same granddaughter who once ran across parking lots just to hug me. As the days passed, a troubling question began forming in my mind. Children do not suddenly change years of affection without a reason. Something was influencing them. I simply did not know what it was yet. And somewhere behind the growing silence, answers were waiting. The answer arrived when I least expected it. About a week after Noah's birthday dinner, Jason stopped by my house to return a toolbox he had borrowed months earlier. Rebecca and the children were not with him. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things. Work, traffic, home repairs. The conversation felt relaxed, almost comforting. For a little while, I forgot about the growing distance that had been troubling me for weeks. Then Noah called his father. Jason placed the phone on speaker while he searched for something in the garage. I could hear Noah's voice clearly through the kitchen. At first, he was discussing a school project. Then the conversation shifted unexpectedly. "Dad," Noah said, "is Grandma still upset that she does not get to make all the family decisions anymore?" I froze. Jason froze too. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The question itself was surprising enough. But what shocked me even more was the way it was phrased. It did not sound like something a 12-year-old would naturally say. It sounded like an adult opinion wrapped inside a child's voice. Jason asked where he had heard that. Noah hesitated before replying that he had heard conversations at home. Then he quickly changed the subject. After the call ended, an uncomfortable silence settled across the kitchen. Jason looked confused. I felt something else entirely. Recognition. For the first time, I had heard evidence that matched the feeling I had been carrying for months. Someone was shaping the children's perception of me. The question was who, and to what extent. Later that evening, I found myself replaying dozens of interactions in my mind. Suddenly, certain moments began making more sense. Lily's distant phone call. Noah's hesitation when I invited him over. The way both children seemed to view ordinary situations through a new lens. It was as though they had been given a different version of who I was. A few days later, another clue appeared. I attended one of Noah's baseball games and sat in the bleachers with several parents and grandparents. During a break between innings, Noah wandered over to say hello. The conversation started normally enough. Then he casually mentioned that some people become controlling when they get older because they are afraid of losing importance. Again, I felt that same jolt of recognition. These were not observations coming from personal experience. They were conclusions. Conclusions that sounded remarkably similar to the comments I had occasionally heard Rebecca make over the years. I smiled and changed the subject because I did not want Noah to feel uncomfortable. None of this was his fault. He was 12. Children trust the people closest to them. They absorb information without questioning where it originated. As I drove home that evening, a difficult realization settled over me. The problem was no longer a mystery. The problem was influence. Somewhere behind closed doors, a story was being told about me. A story that portrayed ordinary involvement as control. A story that transformed love into interference. A story that the children were gradually beginning to believe. What hurt most was not anger toward Rebecca. It was the fear that Lily and Noah were losing access to the grandmother they had always known because someone else was rewriting the relationship for them. And although I still did not know the full extent of what had been said, one thing had become painfully clear. Those were not a child's words. They belonged to someone else. The moment that hurt the most arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. It was not a harsh comment. It was not an argument. It was a photograph. Sometimes a single image can reveal more than an entire conversation. I was sitting in my living room scrolling through social media when a new post appeared from one of my nieces. The picture showed nearly the entire family gathered together at a lakeside park about 20 minutes outside Franklin. There were picnic tables, balloons, coolers filled with drinks, and smiling faces everywhere. Lily was there. Noah was there. Jason and Rebecca were there. Several cousins were there. Even relatives who lived nearly an hour away had attended. I stared at the image for several seconds before realizing what felt wrong. I had never heard about the gathering. There had been no phone call, no invitation, no text message, nothing. At first I assumed the event must have been organized at the last minute. That explanation lasted less than 5 minutes. As I continued looking through photographs, I noticed decorations, customized shirts, and food stations that clearly required advanced planning. This was not a spontaneous afternoon at the park. It was a carefully organized family event. And somehow, I had been left out. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Not because I believed every gathering should revolve around me. Families are busy. People have lives. Missing a single event is not a tragedy. What troubled me was the pattern. The birthday dinner, the school event, the increasingly distant phone calls. And now this. One incident can be explained. For incidents begin to tell a story. Later that evening, I called Jason. I kept my voice calm because I genuinely wanted to understand. When I mentioned the gathering, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he said something that surprised me. He thought I already knew about it. According to him, Rebecca had mentioned inviting me several weeks earlier. I told him no such conversation had ever happened. Another silence followed. Neither of us argued. Neither of us raised our voices. Yet for the first time, I sensed uncertainty in his tone. It was as though he was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. A few days later, another unexpected moment occurred. I stopped by a local bookstore and happened to run into Lily. She was browsing young adult novels while waiting for a friend. We exchanged a hug, though it felt more reserved than it once would have. For a few minutes, the conversation flowed naturally. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. She mentioned that she was glad I was giving the family more space lately because everyone needed room to make their own decisions. The sentence sounded strangely familiar, not because I had heard Lily say it before, but because it echoed the same ideas Noah had repeated during his phone call. Different words, same message. I gently asked what she meant. Lily looked uncomfortable. Then she shrugged and said that people had talked about it at home. Before I could ask another question, her friend arrived and the conversation ended. Driving home that afternoon, I felt both saddened and strangely relieved. Saddened because the distance was clearly real. Relieved because I was finally beginning to understand its source. The children were not pulling away on their own. They were responding to a narrative that had been repeated often enough to sound true. And somewhere within that narrative, I had become a person they no longer recognized. What I did not know yet was that the breakthrough I had been searching for was much closer than I imagined, and it would arrive from the person I least expected. The breakthrough arrived on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and it came from Lily. Looking back, I think she had been carrying questions for a long time. Questions have a way of growing heavier when answers do not make sense. I was organizing books in my study when my phone rang. Seeing Lily's name on the screen immediately surprised me. Over the previous months, most of our conversations had been brief and distant. This felt different before I even answered. Her voice sounded nervous. Not cold, not distracted, nervous. She asked whether she could stop by after school because she wanted to talk. I agreed immediately. 2 hours later, she arrived alone. The moment she walked through the front door, I sensed something had changed. We sat at the kitchen table with glasses of iced tea between us. For several minutes, she discussed ordinary things. Classes, volleyball, friends. It felt almost like our old conversations. Then she became quiet. Finally, she looked at me and asked a question that made my heart sink. Grandma, why did you stop wanting to be part of family events? For a moment, I genuinely could not speak. The question itself was painful, but what hurt even more was the assumption behind it. Someone had convinced her that my absence was a choice. I carefully asked why she believed that. Lily hesitated before explaining. According to what she had heard over the past year, I preferred controlling family gatherings. When people started making decisions without me, I supposedly lost interest in participating. She said she had heard versions of that explanation many times. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes as casual comments during everyday conversations. As she spoke, pieces of the puzzle finally began falling into place. Every strange interaction suddenly made sense. The missed invitations, the emotional distance, the borrowed language, the assumptions. None of it had appeared overnight. A narrative had been built gradually, one small comment at a time. What struck me most was how sincerely Lily believed she understood the situation. She was not being malicious. She was trying to make sense of information she trusted. I took a deep breath and asked a simple question. If I truly wanted less involvement with the family, why would I continue calling? Why would I keep inviting everyone over? Why would I ask about events I supposedly no longer cared about? Lily frowned. The contradiction was obvious once she considered it. Then I gently explained several situations from my perspective. The community event I had never been told about. Noah's birthday dinner I learned about afterward. The family gathering at the lake that nobody mentioned. As I spoke, confusion slowly replaced certainty on her face. She admitted she had never heard those details before. Then she revealed something else. Several months earlier, she had questioned why I was missing from a family activity. Rebecca had responded that some people create their own distance and then blame others for it. At the time, Lily accepted the explanation. Now she was no longer sure. We talked for nearly an hour. There was no confrontation, no criticism, no attempt to convince her that anyone was a villain. I simply shared facts. By the end of the conversation, Lily seemed thoughtful in a way I had not seen for months. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but it felt different from the polite embraces we had exchanged recently. It felt genuine. After she drove away, I sat alone at the kitchen table replaying everything she had said. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt hope. Not because the problem was solved. It was not. But because questions had finally entered the story. And once children begin asking questions, narratives built on assumptions rarely survive for very long. The days following Lily's visit felt different. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. There were no confrontations, no emotional family meetings, no sudden confessions. Yet beneath the quiet routine of everyday life, something had shifted. Questions were now moving through the family, and questions have a way of uncovering things that certainty keeps hidden. A week after our conversation, Lily called me again. This time she did not sound distant. She sounded curious. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes about school, volleyball, and a college campus she hoped to visit one day. For the first time in months, the conversation felt natural. Before hanging up, she casually mentioned that she and Noah had been comparing memories from different family events. The comment seemed harmless, but something about it caught my attention. I asked what she meant. Lily laughed softly and explained that they were realizing how often their assumptions about certain situations did not match what had actually happened. She did not elaborate further, but I sensed the significance immediately. Meanwhile, Noah began changing as well. One Saturday morning, he called unexpectedly and asked whether I still had the fishing rod we used years ago at a nearby lake. The question alone made me smile. For months, nearly every interaction had felt strained. Now he was initiating conversations again. During our discussion, he mentioned that he had recently asked his father about several family gatherings I supposedly chose not to attend. Jason's answers had surprised him. Apparently, Jason knew nothing about me declining invitations. In fact, he believed I had either been informed or included. That detail created another crack in the story the children had been hearing. As those cracks widened, inconsistencies became harder to ignore. One evening, Lily questioned why I would repeatedly call, send birthday gifts, attend games, and ask about family events if I truly wanted distance. The logic simply did not fit. Children are remarkably perceptive once they begin evaluating information instead of absorbing it. The more they examined what they had been told, the more contradictions they discovered. Around the same time, Jason began noticing them as well. During a family dinner, Noah innocently referenced a conversation about me supposedly refusing to support certain family plans. Jason immediately looked confused because no such disagreement had ever occurred. According to Noah, the story had been discussed more than once at home. That moment apparently triggered concerns Jason could no longer dismiss. For the first time, he started asking questions of his own. Not accusations. Questions. The kind that force people to explain details instead of relying on assumptions. What happened next was revealing. Whenever specific examples were requested, the explanations became vague. General claims replaced concrete events. Feelings replaced facts. Narratives that had once sounded convincing became much harder to defend when examined closely. None of this happened in a dramatic way. There were no explosive arguments. The truth was emerging through ordinary conversations, which made it even more powerful. One afternoon, while drinking coffee on my back porch, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The sadness remained, but it was no longer accompanied by helplessness. For months, I had feared that my relationship with Lily and Noah was disappearing forever. Now I realized something important. Genuine relationships leave evidence behind. Years of love, support, and shared experiences cannot be erased by a few carefully repeated comments. Eventually, reality begins speaking for itself. And as more family members started comparing stories, asking questions, and examining assumptions, the narrative that had pushed me to the margins was beginning to unravel. The children were no longer accepting every explanation they heard. They were looking for the truth, and the truth was finally starting to find its way home. The turning point arrived during what should have been an ordinary family dinner. By then, weeks had passed since Lily's visit to my house, and the atmosphere within the family was noticeably different. People were asking more questions. Assumptions were being examined instead of accepted. Most importantly, Lily and Noah had begun comparing what they had been told with what they had personally experienced. That simple change was proving more powerful than anyone realized. The dinner took place at Jason and Rebecca's home on a warm Friday evening. I almost declined the invitation because part of me still feared feeling like an outsider. Fortunately, I decided to attend. Looking back, I am grateful I did. The evening started pleasantly enough. Everyone gathered around the dining table, sharing stories about work, school, and upcoming summer plans. For a while, the conversation flowed naturally. Then Noah mentioned the fishing trip we had been discussing. He excitedly asked whether we could visit the same lake where we used to spend entire afternoons catching bluegill and bass. Before I could answer, Rebecca casually remarked that it was nice to see me showing interest again after supposedly pulling away from family activities. The room became unusually quiet. In the past, comments like that would have passed without discussion. This time was different. Noah immediately looked confused. Then he asked a simple question. If Grandma had pulled away, why was she always the one calling us? The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Rebecca seemed caught off guard. She smiled and attempted to brush the question aside, explaining that relationships can be complicated. Yet Noah did not seem satisfied. Neither did Lily. A few moments later, Lily mentioned the community event from earlier that year. She asked why I had not attended if I cared so much about family involvement. Before anyone else could respond, Jason quietly said that he had always assumed I had been invited. Once again, the room fell silent. For the first time, multiple versions of the same story were colliding in front of everyone. Rebecca tried to explain that misunderstandings happen. Nobody argued with her. Nobody raised their voice. Yet the children were no longer accepting explanations without examining them. Lily gently pointed out that several situations no longer made sense. If I truly wanted distance, why did I continue showing up at games? Why did I keep calling? Why did I ask about events I supposedly preferred to avoid? Her questions were calm and respectful. That was what made them so difficult to dismiss. As the conversation continued, a pattern emerged that everyone could see. The assumptions the children had been carrying were based largely on comments they had heard rather than experiences they had actually lived. The realization seemed to affect Lily and Noah deeply. They began sharing memories that contradicted the image they had gradually formed of me. Birthday celebrations, school performances, weekends spent baking cookies and building science projects. Those memories belonged to a grandmother who had always wanted to be present, not someone trying to control the family from a distance. Throughout the evening, nobody accused Rebecca of anything. The truth did not require accusations anymore. The inconsistencies were speaking for themselves. By the time dessert was served, I noticed something remarkable. The children were no longer looking at me through someone else's interpretation. They were looking at me through their own memories. and those memories were far stronger than the narrative that had been quietly built around them. Driving home later that night, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Relief. Not because every problem had been solved, not because every relationship had healed, but because the most important barrier had finally begun to crumble. The children were no longer asking what they should believe. They were starting to trust what they knew. After that dinner, the change became impossible to miss. For months, I had felt as though I was watching my relationship with Lily and Noah slowly disappear through a fog I could not explain. Now the fog was lifting, not because someone exposed a secret or delivered a dramatic confession. It was happening because the children had started trusting their own experiences. Once that process began, the truth moved surprisingly quickly. The following weekend, Lily called and asked if she could spend Saturday afternoon with me. It was the first time in nearly a year that she had initiated plans herself. We visited a local bookstore, had lunch at a small cafe in downtown Franklin, and spent hours talking. At first, our conversation focused on ordinary things: school, friends, college dreams. Then, while we were walking past a row of historic storefronts, she stopped and asked a question that revealed how much had changed. She wanted to know whether I had ever complained about being excluded from family events. I answered honestly. I told her that I had been hurt, but I had never wanted her or Noah to feel caught in the middle of adult misunderstandings. Lily nodded thoughtfully. Then she admitted something that broke my heart. For a long time, she believed I viewed myself as the most important person in the family and became upset whenever decisions were made without me. Hearing those words was painful, yet I was not angry. I recognized them immediately. They sounded exactly like the narrative that had been quietly shaping her perception of me for months. What mattered was what happened next. Lily looked down at the sidewalk and said she no longer believed it. She explained that the version of me she knew did not match the version she had been hearing about. The contradiction had become impossible to ignore. Around the same time, Noah was reaching similar conclusions. During one of our fishing trips, he casually mentioned that he had started noticing how often stories about people changed depending on who was telling them. For a 12-year-old, it was a remarkably insightful observation. He then pointed out something simple but powerful. Every memory he had of me involved encouragement, support, and showing up when it mattered. That memory did not align with the image he had gradually been encouraged to accept. What touched me most was that neither child seemed interested in blaming anyone. They were focused on understanding. That maturity gave me hope for the future. Over the following weeks, old routines slowly returned. Lily began sending photographs from volleyball games again. Noah called to discuss baseball and fishing. Family gatherings felt more comfortable. The emotional wall that had separated us was no longer growing. It was disappearing. Meanwhile, Jason was undergoing his own process of reflection. The more he examined past situations, the more questions emerged. He started recognizing how many assumptions had entered family conversations over the years without ever being challenged. Once he began evaluating events based on facts rather than interpretations, his perspective changed significantly. Through all of this, I remained careful not to encourage resentment. The children did not need another narrative. They needed stability. They needed honesty. They needed the freedom to reach their own conclusions. One evening, while sitting on my porch watching the sunset spread across the Tennessee sky, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was a photograph from Lily. She, Noah, and several friends were smiling after a school event. Attached to the picture was a short message. "Wish you could have been there today, Grandma." I smiled as I read it. For months, I had feared losing something precious forever. Now I realized that genuine love leaves traces that are difficult to erase. The truth had not arrived through confrontation. It had arrived through consistency. And consistency was finally helping the children see what had been there all along. Several months later, life felt remarkably different. Not because every disagreement had disappeared, or because every relationship had become perfect. Families rarely work that way. What changed was something far more valuable. The truth no longer had to compete with assumptions. Once Lily and Noah began trusting their own experiences, the foundation of our relationship became stronger than ever. One crisp autumn afternoon, I received a phone call from Lily while she was driving home from volleyball practice. She spent nearly 30 minutes telling me about a difficult game, a challenging assignment, and a college fair she hoped to attend the following spring. As I listened, I realized something that made me smile. The conversation felt exactly like the ones we used to have years earlier. Natural, comfortable, effortless. The distance that once seemed impossible to overcome had quietly disappeared. Noah changed too. He began stopping by the house after school again. Sometimes he needed help with homework. Sometimes he simply wanted to talk. One afternoon, while we were cleaning fishing gear in my garage, he said something I will never forget. He told me he had learned that people should pay attention to how someone treats them personally instead of relying entirely on what others say. The wisdom in that statement surprised me, but it also filled me with pride. He was growing into a thoughtful young man capable of forming his own conclusions. Around the same time, Jason and I developed a stronger relationship as well. We spent more time talking openly about family communication and the importance of asking questions before accepting assumptions. Neither of us focused on blame. We focused on understanding. That shift made a tremendous difference. Interestingly, Rebecca also seemed different. The change was gradual, but it was noticeable. She became more careful with her words. She stopped making broad assumptions about other people's motives. Family conversations became less about interpretation and more about facts. Whether those changes came from reflection, discomfort, or personal growth, I cannot say with certainty. What mattered was that the atmosphere around the family became healthier. The emotional tension that had once shaped every gathering slowly faded away. Then came the moment that brought everything full circle. During the following summer, the family organized another large picnic at the same lakeside park where I had once seen photographs of an event I never knew existed. This time, the invitation arrived weeks in advance. Lily personally called to make sure I would attend. Noah reminded me twice. When the day finally arrived, I watched my grandchildren run toward me across the grass with the same enthusiasm they had shown years earlier. Their smiles were genuine. Their hugs were genuine. Nothing felt forced. As we spent the afternoon laughing, eating, and sharing stories, I looked around at the people I loved and realized something important. Relationships built on years of care do not disappear easily. They can become clouded. They can become strained. They can even be misunderstood. But genuine love leaves a record that survives far longer than rumors, assumptions, or carefully crafted narratives. Later that evening, after the picnic ended, I sat beside the lake watching the sunset reflect across the water. Lily and Noah were talking nearby. Jason was helping pack supplies into a truck. The peaceful scene reminded me of everything this journey had taught me. The most powerful response to misunderstanding is not anger. It is consistency. The most effective answer to false assumptions is not revenge. It is truth. And the strongest family bonds are not maintained by controlling how people think. They are maintained by showing up, year after year, with patience, kindness, and love. Looking back now, I never expected anyone to create distance between me and the children I adored. But I also never expected to learn such an important lesson. Love may be questioned. It may be misunderstood. It may even be challenged. Yet when it is genuine, it has a remarkable way of finding its path back home.